Thank you, Dr. Stephanie, for inviting me, and your stalking days are over. I'm really happy to be here and among this panel, and I'm remembering my days spent getting a master's degree in English at Atlanta University many years ago, and actually that was really the beginning of my work on the confluence of race and gender, where I wrote a master's thesis on Faulkner's treatment of women in his major novels. So my intellectual political development actually began right here in the Atlanta University Center, not somewhere else. African American men's contributions to progressive gender or pro-feminist activism have been largely ignored in mainstream black political history. Du Bois is passionate, and in many ways very atypical commitment to the eradication of gender oppression, for example, has received much less scholarly attention than his anti-racist and anti-colonial discourse. My own work on Du Bois, which began when I was a doctoral student at Emory University, has focused on his gender politics and his attitudes toward African American women. The title of that dissertation I wrote, Daughters of Sorrow, was inspired by the riveting essay, Damnation of Women, which appeared in his 1920 publication, A Dark Water. I also wrote a much more focused essay entitled Remembering Our Feminist Forefathers, which appeared in a wonderful anthology by Athena Mutua entitled Progressive Black Masculinities. I also want to mention the really important work of Gary Lemons, who wrote a text, a monograph entitled Womanist Forefathers, Frederick Douglass and William E.B. Du Bois. And one of the arguments that Lemons and I make in my work is that Du Bois believed deeply in the relationship, the coterminous relationship between democratic movements for race and gender rights, even though there's been a heavy focus on his race work. While I am going to talk briefly about the Philadelphia Negro, which was published in 1899, I want to provide a broader context for this seminal text. And my main argument this morning, very briefly, is that there is already an important gender dimension in the Philadelphia Negro, which will be more manifest throughout the rest of his work. So I am proposing that Du Bois approached this sociological research, and this was very unusual in the 1890s, approached his work in the Philadelphia Negro with an already deep sensitivity to the intersection between race, class, and gender in analysis of African American communities. I want to begin my claim by taking us back to an often ignored essay in the Souls of Black Folk, as a way of me focusing on the Philadelphia Negro. Though largely ignored, Du Bois's essay of the meaning of progress, and I can remember when I was writing this essay earlier that I don't ever really remember this essay when I was reading the Souls of Black Folk. And this essay is very rarely mentioned. Though largely ignored, this essay of the meaning of progress revealed already Du Bois's progressive gender politics, which he seemed to have developed at a very early age, and somewhere else I've talked about that. While he was an undergraduate student at Fisk University in 1886, and I think this is really important, he went for 2 consecutive summers to teach at a school for poor rural blacks in Tennessee. This essay includes the heroic, long-suffering black female figure Josie, the young schoolgirl who had impacted him the most, and one of the most poignant portraits of a black community struggling to survive and trying to maintain a sense of dignity in the most depressing of circumstances. The plight of females in this tiny community is perhaps the most memorable aspect of Du Bois's recollections. 10 years after graduating from Fisk, Du Bois returned to the hills of Tennessee and learned of Josie's death and the troubles her family and others had endured. Her life, like the lives of so many poor black women, had been tough and consumed with unrelenting labor and very little happiness. Following the tragedy of her brother Jim having to leave town because of a racial incident, Josie, I'm reading from the text, Josie grew thin and silent, yet worked the more. Unfulfilled as an adult, and I'm quoting now again from Dubois, Josie shivered and worked on, with the vision of school days all fled, with a face wan and tired, worked until, on a summer's day, someone married another. Then Josie crept to her mother like a hurt child and slept and sleeps. You're going to see this theme a little bit later in Philadelphia Negro. Here Dubois reminds us of her unfulfilled dreams and her loneliness. Listening to the life struggles of another family, Dubois learned from Uncle Ben that a neighbor, another a black female, came wandering back to her home over yonder to escape the blows of her husband. And the next morning she died in the home that the little bow-legged brother, working and saving, had bought for their widowed mother. This very brief allusion to domestic violence illustrates Dubois's sensitivity to the particular plight of women. In this case, black families suffering under the indignities of racial oppression, including lynching and poverty. He also reminds us that black women suffer at the hands of their menfolk. I want to go down to the Philadelphia Negro, in which I am arguing that we see already in 1899 the thinking of a gender-progressive black male scholar who supports the social, economic, and political plight of black women. While there has been little attention to the gendered aspects of this text, even though it includes, you might remember, a special report on Negro domestic service in the 7th Ward, and graphs about the economic plight of black women, I want to call attention very briefly to the ways in which Du Bois's attention to gender issues within African American communities anticipates contemporary issues. One of the things that he focuses on in Philadelphia Negro is a differential male-female sex ratios among African Americans in Philly's 7th Ward, and the consequences of this gender balance. So here you have Du Bois writing about the consequence, first of all noticing, and then speaking about the consequences of gender imbalance within the black community. And he does not always frame, as you will see, this gender imbalance, the consequences of this gender imbalance solely within the context of racism. He notices, for example, that there's a much larger number of marriageable women in Philadelphia's 7th Ward, which he argues leads to lower marriage rates, the increased incidence of temporary cohabitation, and higher rates of illegitimacy. And while he doesn't have the kind of specific stats that he would have had 50 or 60 years later, it is interesting of what he does with this. Now, he explains this in this way. This differential sex ratio has been the result of mostly larger number of females migrating from the south to the north because of the presence of mostly domestic service jobs. In other words, men, African American men, knew that that was not as much a reason to come to Philadelphia because of the scarcity of jobs. So large numbers of Southern black women come to Philadelphia, and he tells us that for the 100 black women in the community, there are only 89 men. And for every 100 women of marrying age, he was very focused as well on the marriageable situation. Between the ages of 20 to 34, there were only 75 men. So he notices, he pays attention to this. So he said, so one black woman in 4 in this community had no eligible male partner, which is going to be a very familiar situation later. So he also noticed that there was a much lower incidence of African American men who married, and Du Bois theorizes that this lower what we call a less interest in marriage on the part of African American men had to do with their smaller numbers and their greater pool of available women who were competing for very scarce male attention. He also argued that in this situation of gender imbalance, African American women frequently lowered their expectations for what constitutes an acceptable partner. This is really amazing that Du Bois is talking about this at the turn of the century. And this is just one quote from the Philadelphia Negro. In social gatherings in the churches, men are always at a premium. And this very often leads to lowering the standard of admission to certain circles and often gives one the impression that the social level of the women is higher than the level of the men. The another problematic from Du Bois's perspective of this imbalance is a high number of out of wedlock births. He also comments, and I believe what he noticed as a fifth student and what he's commenting upon now has to do with his own personal history. You may know that his father abandoned his mother shortly after he was born, and so Du Bois is extremely sensitive always to the plight of abandoned African American women. And the other thing that he commented commented about was that even when African American men married, they had a higher percentage of abandonment because there was not as much incentive to remain at home because there was just this huge pool of women. And this is just one quote from Du Bois, and again I think he always says his mother. Okay, the number of deserted wives, however lying for false reports, in other words he's saying maybe the women are not always telling the truth, is astoundingly large and presents many intricate problems. The causes of desertion are partly laxity. Now this was not based on any statistics that we know of, this was his theorizing. The causes of desertion are partly laxity in morals and partly the difficulty of supporting a family. I mean, he did talk about the economic situation. So let me just, since I have one more minute, let me just move to a closure by saying that Du Bois is also sensitive to the differences between the experiences of black women and black men and the effects of both race and gender oppression. He does not have this monolithic notion that the black experience impacts black people in the same way. He spoke also about black women being stereotyped and confined to highly restrictive job roles. I mean, he was just deeply observant of the particular plight of African American women vis-a-vis African American men. And even though this is not as fully fleshed out in the Philadelphia Negro as would get to be later, what I'm arguing is that the gender sensitivity that Du Bois, that we're aware of in Souls of Black Folk in that one essay, the impact of Josie on him, the memory of his mother, situated him always to be a progressive, transgressive, race, gender man who was deeply committed to the eradication of both racism and sexism. Thank you.